Now I feel like when it comes to Wrath of the Lich King, a lot of people focus on 25-man raiding, and that's absolutely the way to go, because in Wrath of the Lich King, obviously the best gear comes from 25-man, so even though 10-mans we do, whether it's for emblems or there's that odd piece of BIS gear that comes from 10-man hard modes or 10-man heroic, but the majority of the time, most people's focus is on 25. ICC is no exception, except that even on 10-man the heroic difficulty is quite difficult. And I say that loosely because obviously it will depend on your group composition, your players' skill, their knowledge of the fights, but 10-man is quite challenging. It's not something that you're just going to walk in and bosses are going to fall over. You still need to handle the mechanics properly. You've got some really strong items that come from 10-man, such as Lady Deathwhisper's melee trinket, obviously the Lich King heroic weapons being 271 item level just from a 10-man, and there's other bits and bobs that you're going to want. Even Muradin's is quite strong, but ultimately will probably be replaced. I think making a 25-man comp is easy, whereas making a 10-man comp, when you need to try and cover all of the mechanics and making sure that you've got people that can counter those mechanics, and then also covering as many buffs and debuffs for your group, and ultimately with only 10 spots available, you've got to try and cover a lot. So whilst I wouldn't say there's any BIS 10-man comp setup like maybe even the thumbnail of this video suggests, I think it's important when you're creating your 10-mans for that launch week, you understand exactly what you need, you know, because there are some roles that you absolutely need, and I don't mean tanks, healers, I mean certain things that have to be dispelled, certain things that need to be managed and they're made easier by other classes or certain specs. So we're going to talk through that, and this is going to be a bit different to normal videos that I put out because we're going to learn this as we go. And what I mean by that is I've not done this before we're starting. We're just going to talk through it, we're going to see what we come up with, and then you can suggest any changes to how you would take the comp and things that you would and wouldn't use in this group, basically, in the comments below. So before we get started, make sure you like, subscribe, grab yourself a beer, and let's get started. So we're going to go through each boss, and there's some that I'm going to spend more time focusing on than others, obviously, because things like Marrogar, for example, all you need is 2 tanks. What 2 tanks you've got makes very little difference, and there's no special mechanics that need to be handled by any particular class. The reason you need 2 tanks is to split the damage of Bone Slice, but outside of that really, a good mix of melee and ranged and having 2 healers, even on heroic, is pretty much all you need. So for now, all we're going to do is just slap in 2 protection paladins. This is more of a placeholder. If there was something where I could just select tank, I would, because what tanks we have are going to make a difference as we go through later, so there will be adjustments to all of this as we go through. Even though there's not a lot going on in this boss, we do know that we're going to need 2 healers, because we're going to need 2 healers for every boss. Now on the basis Bone Slice is hitting both tanks at the same time for quite a hefty amount, it makes sense that one of the healers is going to be a Holy Paladin. For the other spot of healer, that will become more apparent as we look at other bosses, but again, like we've done with the tanks, for now we're just going to stick in another Holy Paladin, but we know one of the protection paladins is going to change and one of the Holy Paladins is going to change, probably. Now Lady Deathwhisper on 10-man heroic is a completely different story to 25-man heroic. You've just got a lot more room to move, seeing the ghost is a lot easier, and ultimately you probably shouldn't have many problems with this. The only thing that's really going to help, outside of, yeah, having your 2 tanks and your 2 healers, there's a curse that goes out, and the curse is incredibly annoying. It's called Curse of Torpor, and it's casted by the Adherents. Now on the basis it's 10-man, the ads should blow up pretty quick, you shouldn't see too many of them, but having at least one person that can get rid of Curse is going to obviously be extremely useful. Now for this, I'm going to put a Balance Druid in, and that's mainly because at the moment the way the comp looks, it's going to be extremely useful to have that decurse like I've said, but we're also going to get Gift of the Wild, 3% haste, 5% spell crit, 3% spell hit, 13% spell damage taken, and then we're going to get Innovate and Combat Res. So that one slot is going to cover quite a lot, and it's going to sort of fill the needs of what we need on Deathwhisper. Outside of that on Deathwhisper, there's not a lot to worry about. You do need to manage your threat, so actually having a Hunter or a Rogue in here would also be useful, but I don't want to fill too many slots up when we're only on the 2nd boss. Next up, Gunship. Yeah, we can skip Gunship. Honestly, it doesn't really matter what you've got. You'll be able to do this without even having a full raid of 10 people. And then on to Sarfang. Now, he can be done pretty much with just any balanced raid comp, so I don't think there's anything we specifically need to put in here. We've got the Holy Paladin, which is going to help when Sarfang puts a mark out. So basically when he reaches 100 runic power, he's going to then put a mark on somebody, like a random person, and that person needs healing. And if they die with a mark, the boss heals. So having the Holy Paladin that can beacon the first person that gets marked and then heal the current tank, because both tanks are not taking damage at the same time, is very useful. But on the basis we've already got 2 Holy Paladins in, which we know one of those is going to disappear soon, we're pretty much covered with a mark. But what we are going to need is a few ranged DPS, because we're going to want range DPS dealing with the adds. You can even have melee lock one down. But on the basis we do need these DPS on Saurfang, we're going to put them in. So we're going to add 2 range at the moment, and we're just going to try and cover as many buffs and debuffs and think about what we can actually bring to the group. So the boss frenzies as well at 30%. So we are going to want a bloodlust or heroism. So we're definitely going to put a shaman in. Now at some point we may change the Holy Paladin for a resto shaman, but for now we're going to put an Ellie shaman in. And again, thinking about we want a range, but we also want a beneficial range that's going to bring more to the group. We're going to put a Demonology Warlock in, because the Demo Warlock's going to bring the 5% crit. It's obviously going to bring Dark Pact, which is going to not only buff your casters, but also your healers. So when you've got a couple of casters in the group, having one of them as a Demo Lock is obviously very useful. And they are useful on Saurfang, because if an ad gets close to you, as long as you've got a portal down behind you, you can get a little bit more space and a little bit more time for that Blood Beast to actually die. So I would say, without worrying about what melee we're going to put in, or whether we put another caster in or anything like that, I would say Saurfang is going to be comfortable, and there's nothing in particular that we're going to need that's going to help us out. We'll leave the end wing bosses until last, so let's just cover Rotface and Festegut. Now Rotface, again, you just need 2 tanks, because you're going to need one that's running around in circles kiting the oozes, and you're going to have one that's tanking the boss. You do need ranged out, so you're not going to get Vile Gas in melee, but we do have 5 ranged if we was to count the 2 healers in as well, so there's no problem there. This is honestly a very easy fight, and I wouldn't say there's anything in particular that you can take that's going to make any difference at all, so we're not going to fill any of these slots up. I would almost say the same for Festegut as well here. Festegut can be made a bit quicker and slightly easier by having more full immunities or even Shadow Priests in the group, but honestly, you're just stacking the spores, you're getting 3 stacks, you're using cooldowns on the tank when the boss has got 2 to 3 stacks. There's not really a great deal going on, not where any classes could really be required to be able to do this fight. So Putricide's the end wing boss of Plague, so we'll leave that until we get to the end wing bosses, because they're probably going to be the bosses where we are going to actually need to think about our comp a little bit more. And on Voliphria, you're definitely going to need at least 2 healers, so you can comfortably heal Heroic with 1 healer out and 1 healer in, especially if that healer that's going in is a Holy Paladin, but you could opt for safety and use a 3rd healer here. But we will just assume for the sake of this video that the Ellie Shaman or the Balance Druid have got an off-spec resto, so you could get one of those to heal. The only other things really that you need to worry about are Archmages do need interrupting, so this would probably be a good time to drop a melee into this group, just so we have got another slot filled, and it's going to be someone that can interrupt mages. We do have the Ellie Shaman, but if we was to assume the Ellie Shaman went resto, we're going to want someone that can reliably interrupt. Now we do have options here, but when we actually look at what casters we've got, they've all got good single target, but they've also got a good amount of cleave. So if we were to go for something like an Assassination Rogue, we're now going to have Tricks, which I said would have been useful on Death Whisper, so that's going to be covering that. We've also got really good single target DPS from the Assassination Rogue for things like Saurfang, and we've now also got someone that can interrupt. Now onto Council. Really, there's not that much where comp is going to make too much of a difference, except for the fact that Keleseth, which is the boss on the far left when you walk in, ideally you want it being tanked by Blood DK. They'll be going round and collecting the nuclei and then basically just getting slapped in the face by the boss, but on the basis the boss does like Shadow Lances exclusively, it's just pure shadow damage. Obviously DKs excel at magic damage tanking, essentially. So it kind of makes sense that we're going to drop one of the prop paladins now and stick a Blood DK in. What this also is going to mean is if we assume that the Blood DK was bringing double buff, meaning 10% attack power from A-Bomb's Might and a 20% haste from Icy Talons, you're now helping that Assassination Rogue out as well. So all of a sudden, just by switching that tank up, we've brought another 2 buffs to the group. So before we actually finish off Council and think if there's anything else that's going to be useful, it'd probably be a good time to look at what buffs and debuffs are we actually missing. On the basis some of these bosses hit incredibly hard, not having stamina is probably not a good thing. Now of course you could bring scrolls, or you could put a warrior in, potentially one of those last 2 slots. But at the moment we're running with 2 Holy Paladins, so it kind of makes sense that we're going to want to drop in a Disc Priest, because there's quite a lot of predictable damage that goes around, and on Heroic, when people are moving too much, they're going to be taking damage. Both the tanks are going to be getting slapped pretty hard, so your one Holy Paladin is going to be pretty much out of commission because he's going to be focusing on the tanks. So having a good Disc Priest just mitigating all that damage, you're definitely going to want. So now we're running Protection Paladin and Blood DK, which again, by the time we get to the last boss, absolutely could change, and we're running Holy Paladin and Disc Priest. You probably saw that coming before you even clicked on the video, because I feel like it's kind of like the go-to comp for even Ulduar. Now there are still some buffs that we're missing, but none that are massively important to the group at the moment, outside of replenishment. So ideally basically what we want to do is cover this replenishment buff, but also cover a quite annoying mechanic on the council, which is the orbs. So the orbs slowly fall down towards the floor. Now, these are made quite easy if you've got people that can just put pets on them. Now, we've got a demo lock that could put a pet on it. What's the other pet class we could take? Oh, a hunter. So if we were to take a survival hunter, the survival hunter, of course, is going to be doing very good damage because they do very good damage, both single target and AoE. It's another misdirect. So we've already got tricks, but we're now going to have misdirect as well, which it's going to help on Valeria with ads. It's going to help on Death Whisper with ads. It's going to help on Death Whisper with the threat debuff that the boss does. And just general trash, speeding it up, MDing everything, you know, throwing traps in now with explosive trap launcher. I think a hunter's going to fit in here nicely, but will it make the cut by the end? Who knows? So what the hunter will be able to do on council is just put his pet on one of the orbs, shoot the other one, or anyone who's close by can shoot it to stop it hitting the floor. So now all we've got left is Sindragosa, Putricide, and Blood Queen Lanafel. We might as well cover Blood Queen Lanafel first because, again, quite honestly, outside of possibly wanting to use a third healer, there's not really that much that's comp dependent. There is one specific spec that does make this fight quite easy, or at least make it easier on your healers, and that's having a Shadow Priest that gets bitten, because the Shadow Priest will do incredible amounts of healing to that party when they're bit. I'm not saying it's something that's needed, unless we think that Shadow Priest would fit perfectly in this group. It's not something I'm going to put in just yet, because it's not going to actually bring anything additional to the group that we haven't already got, outside of that passive healing. If you was wanting to use a third healer on Blood Queen Lanafel, you have got either the Balance Druid or the Ellie Shaman that can potentially go resto off spec, so I would say that's covered as well. There are periods of time where DSAC on all of these fights are obviously going to be useful, and we've got a Prot Paladin and a Holy Paladin, so we've got 2 raid cooldowns just from those. And if we was to think about safety before we move on any further as well, we've got a Soul Stone, we've got an Ankh from the Ellie Shaman, we've got a Combat Res from the Balance Druid. Like, the comp's looking actually pretty well rounded. I'm not sure if a lot's going to change. Moving on to Putricide. Again, a bit like Death Whisper, Putricide is not as difficult on 10 as it is 25, like nowhere near. And that's mainly because one of the sort of more difficult mechanics to handle, which is Variable Ooze, where half the group attacks orange, half the group attacks green, that doesn't exist on 10 man. And you're not going to need a third tank, so of course you're just going to have, let's say, your Blood DK controlling the A-bomb with your Protection Paladin on the boss. Holy Paladin and Disc Priest should be absolutely fine to 2 heal this, but if you wanted a bit of safety for the last phase, again, the Balance or the Ellie could go resto. I think 2 healing would be perfectly fine, because actually having the extra damage for the end is going to be more worthwhile than having the extra healer, because you just want to get the boss done nice and quick. And you do have some ways in this group with this particular comp actually to be able to not necessarily cheese the oozes, but definitely help out. So for example, if the green ooze is moving towards the Warlock can have his portal somewhere and portal away from the green ooze, giving people more time to kill it. You got the Survival Hunter that can let it get very close and then feign death, so it then picks a new target and it can get nuked down. And you've also got a Warlock that could potentially use the Soul Stone to get rid of a Plague. So if you're going into the last phase and you've got a Plague up, you can literally Soul Stone the person, let them die, and you don't need to worry about it. You can just full focus nuking the boss. Obviously you could use that at any time. You could do it right at the start to get rid of the first Plague, but I'd say you probably want it for a time of panic. Because outside of using it in that way, you're probably going to put your Soul Stone on the Balance Druid, so if he dies, he can still use his combat res. So I actually think probably using the Soul Stone as a way to get rid of one of the Plagues is probably what I would do in a comp like this. So I feel like in this comp at the moment, everybody's missing the 3% damage. The Rogue and the Hunter are missing out on 5% crit. We're also missing out on the 4% physical damage taken, and there's no bleed debuff either. But looking at this comp, obviously, there's not really a lot of bleed damage here to worry about. We do only have 1 melee, so putting another melee in the comp would probably make sense. And at this point in time, you might hate me for saying this, but I feel like the one that would make the most sense would be a Rep Paladin. Because if we put a Rep Paladin in, everybody's going to gain that 3% damage. Whereas if we was to put in, let's say, a Feral Druid or a Warrior, you're only going to have a couple of people that are going to benefit from the 5% crit. The 4% physical damage, again, it's only limited people that are going to benefit from that. We don't need the bleed debuff at all. So out of all of those, the thing that's going to actually provide the most output to the entire raid, for me, would be a Rep Paladin. And on the basis, Rep Paladins do actually do pretty significant damage in ICC because everything's undead, and it's going to bring another DSAC, you're going to have another bop, you're going to have a lay on hands. Just for the sheer extra utility, I feel like a ret would sit in here nicely at the moment, even though it probably looks like there's too many paladins taking one of each spec. The paladin might change by the time we get to Lich King, but at the moment, just for the sake of filling the group up, covering as many of the important buffs and debuffs, and covering all the mechanics, that's probably the class that I'd put there. Comment below what you would have put in there. You could chuck an Affliction Warlock in there for more damage, you could chuck even Unholy DK in there for more damage, and more than likely the Unholy DK is going to do more than the Ret Paladin, but the Unholy DK really isn't bringing anything we haven't already got on a single target, but for Cleave, the Unholy DK is going to put the spell damage taken on everything, rather than the Boomy is only ever going to put it on his target. So really, after sitting and thinking about it, I would be torn between Unholy and Ret, but for now, I'm just going to put a Ret Paladin in, and we'll see if it changes. Now, the group is looking pretty balanced. We've got 2 tanks, we've got 2 healers, we've got 2 people capable of off-spec healing when needed, and we've got 4 ranged and 2 melee, including Bloodlust, including Tricks, including MD, including a Demo Warlock for Pact. I mean, looking at this already, I could take this as my, first ICC raid at launch, and probably be quite happy with this comp, providing we've got the people to actually fill those roles. And again, when it comes to that Ret Paladin, put pretty much anything in there in my opinion, but don't rule out a Shadow Priest. If you've got a really good Shadow Priest, don't sleep on Vampiric Embrace, because it's not just useful for Blood Queen Lanafel, like I said earlier. Obviously, it's useful on loads of fights, including Lich King for things like Infest, and just generally, they're going to help healing half of your raid. I'm sticking with a Ret though, because I'm biased. I'm Ret main, so... Now, Syndragosa. Honestly, for this raid comp, it's not going to be great. And I mean that because I genuinely think the more melee you've got actually just makes Syndragosa a lot easier. So where we've got 4 ranged and 2 melee, it would have been a lot better here to have 4 melee and 2 ranged, but it is only for one specific boss, and all it means by having less melee is the boss is just going to take a little bit longer, but as long as you're handling the mechanics properly, it's not going to be any more dangerous. Syndragosa is all about control. Outside of taking a third healer, like a true third healer, not an off-spec healer, you could absolutely do that, but you'd be doing it just for this fight in particular. We've got that Ellie Shaman, and we've got that Balanced Druid there that can go resto, and you absolutely will want a third healer for this. I'm not saying you can't 2-heal it, but it makes it a hell of a lot easier if you've got a third, because one of your healers is pretty much always going to have unstable magic. Now, the way we handle it is we just have that person not heal, or if they're extremely confident with a fight, then they can, but just a few heals, like if you're desperate. But what this means is in the last phase, if one of your healers has got unstable magic and the other one gets turned into an ice tomb, you got nothing. So having a third healer, I almost just see as a requirement, especially early on. Now, there's no classes here that are at a massive disadvantage, and there's no class that we could bring in that's going to make it significantly easier. So I feel like the comp doesn't need to change at all. Even though I want to stress, you could change all of these DPS. You could go for a really melee heavy comp, going with Feral Druid, Combat Rogue, Enhancement Shaman. This is just what I consider quite a good balanced group for week 1. So moving on to Lich King, the last boss, is there anything you're going to need that you haven't got? So some important things to have that can be done without, but will make it easier if you've got, is to be able to get rid of Enrage. So we've got that from the Survival Hunter, and we've even got it from using Shiv as an Assassination Rogue. So far in this comp, the only one that I would question and being in is probably the Assassination Rogue more so than the Ret Paladin, because the Assassination Rogue, if we drop them out, all we're actually losing is the 20% armor debuff, which there's very little benefit from anyway, because the Assassination Rogue probably won't even press expose. And we could put something like an Unholy DK in, because everything that the Rogue was really brought for, the Survival Hunter's doing anyway. So when we was thinking about all of the threat from things like Death Whisper or even Voliphria ads, we've got the Survival Hunter's MD, so the need for tricks is probably not really there. And we're also using 3 classes here now that scale incredibly well more with their magical damage, like Survival Hunter's Explosive Shots and Traps, Unholy's Diseases, and Ret's obviously just holy damage with like Hand of Reckoning and Divine Storm. And actually the loss of that armor reduction is not really doing a great deal for them anyway, as in it's not going to be a big loss. So I think perhaps having an Unholy DK in here instead of a Rogue could make sense. Now in phase 1, the only important things that are going on is there's going to be a disease that needs dispelling, which we've got enough people that can handle that. We're going to want a protection paladin on the ads, and we're going to want the blood DK on the boss. Dispelling the enrage on the ads is useful from the survival hunter, and infest that comes in where everybody's health needs to be healed high before the infest dot drops is made almost insignificant by the disc priest. I really would not want to heal this fight with anything other than a disc priest. When I'm healing on my holy paladin, I've healed this on 10-man heroic on the PTR with a resto druid, who's an amazing resto druid, by the way. It's absolutely nothing against the skill of the resto druid. It's just having a disc priest almost makes infest a non-issue. So we've got all the way to the last boss, and I think it's quite apparent that our tank setup is definitely not changing and our healing setup is definitely not changing. Whilst you could say some of these DPS are interchangeable for other classes, other specs, or even taking multiple of some of them, I feel like it's a good balance. Now when you go further into the fight, quite honestly, again, it's all about just managing things. Yes, warlocks make Valkyrs extremely easy because they can use their teleporter if they're picked up, but quite honestly, on 10-man, it just doesn't matter. And when I think about the other phases, you know, dealing with Defile, dealing with Valkyrs, dealing with Vile Spirits, there's nothing that I can really think, oh, we need that class to actually make it work. So this would actually be, I think, my recommended launch week 10-man comp. Again, I don't want you to fixate on this and be like, oh my god, but you haven't put a Feral in there, or you haven't put a Shadow Priest in there, or you haven't put an Enhancement Shaman in there, because your comp could be completely different to this. But when I'm going through all of the bosses like we just have, and we've thought about every mechanic and everything that we need, this would just work. And that's about it. So if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. Make sure you hit that like button, it helps more than you think. And if there's anything that you would change with it, as I say, just let me know in the comments, or even let me know in the comments what your launch night 10-man or your launch week 10-man is going to look like, and does it look anything like ours? I'll see you on the next one.